Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to talk about the EV ready grid and strategic policy from the perspective of the power sector. So my name is Greg Peniuk. I'm the manager of planning and analytics at Power Advisory, which is an electricity sector management consulting firm. And in my own practice, I'm seeing more and more utilities wondering about EVs, what they need to do, how they can get ahead of this demand growth. And so I'm really interested to talk about these issues today with you and with my panel. And so with that, I'm going to ask the panel to introduce themselves one by one, starting with Herneat.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Harney Panesar. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the Ontario Energy Board. We are the economic energy regulator in the province. We regulate both natural gas and electricity. And previous to being a regulator, I joined to help modernize economic regulation in the province about 2.5 years ago. We've been on a journey of modernization. And prior to that, I was with one of the larger transmission distribution companies here in the province called Hydro One for about 13 years.
Hi, everyone. My name's Rasika Rahumatullah with the Volkswagen Group here in Canada. We're interested in advancing our Volkswagen ID portfolio as well as our Audi e-tron portfolio, and also with the most recent news about our investment in St. Thomas, Ontario.
Greetings. I'm Dave Schaller with the North American Council for Freight Efficiency. That's too much of a mouthful, so let's go with NACFE. I've been in the trucking industry for almost 40 years, introducing all kinds of new technologies to fleets, some that they wanted and some that they didn't want. So I'm in a unique position to answer lots of different questions from basis of experience. And as an unbiased, educational, fuel agnostic nonprofit, we're working with all different kinds of fleets and now utilities as we work on electrification.
All right, thank you. So to start off, I just want to set the stage and open up the question to everyone and ask, from your separate perspectives, what do you see as the biggest challenges with growing the EV ecosystem and making the grid ready for EV growth?
So from our perspective, we've been seeing EVs come on board in the province, and we've been watching what's happening in Canada, and we've been working with the sector to get an understanding what the challenges were. And one of the bigger challenges that we were hearing was around the standardization of the deployment of EV charging infrastructure. Yeah, the province of Ontario is a little bit more unique. We've got about 800 licensed energy entities, but we've got about 60 local distribution companies. So that means 60 different ways of connecting the exact same thing in 60 different areas, possibly 60 different processes, timelines. We wanted to standardize it. I think that was a huge barrier. And talk about efficiencies. One of the things that the minister's office asked us to do was try and standardize the process to bring on EV connections. So my team did a lot of work with the sector, with OEMs, with utilities, and customers to get a sense of what would be the best approach. And we wanted to make sure that it was an enforceable provision. So these timelines weren't just guidance or nice to have sort of timelines. These are provisions that we, the Ontario Energy Board, through my enforcement team, will look to enforce. So we made changes to the code, a few weeks, months ago now. They'll come into effect end of this month, and so we should see a lot more standardization, which will help speed up and make things a lot easier to bring more of that infrastructure to the province.
Okay, thanks. Anything to add from Rusika?
Sure. I think for key challenges, I think it's twofold. It's mindset and it's planning certainty. So for mindset, I think everyone needs to buy into the idea that this transition it's not only necessary but it's also inevitable. We're already in the transition; it's here. The next decade is actually going to be what counts, and it's a very crucial decade. So, and that like blends into planning certainty because we're really kind of doing a systems shift from, the last 100 years was built around gas cars, engines, and fuels, and then we're doing a systems shift to electric cars, batteries, and electricity. And so this decade is going to be expensive because it's a capitally intensive transformation, not just for automakers, but also the electricity sectors. But it's an investment that's meaningful and needs to happen either way for the next 100 years. So we have to look at the long term horizon. This is for generations to come. For Volkswagen Group, we announced last year that we're spending $193 billion on this transformation. Two-thirds of that are on producing batteries, the software development, and securing those supply chains. 7 billion of that right here in Ontario in St. Thomas. So that's great news. But I think For us, it's really important that that North Star be electric. The Paris Agreement made it clear for the climate reasons that 2035 is the date. Now, there's different people who debate that, but to me, it's we can debate the speed, and it really only consumers will dictate the speed. But consumers need to have faith and confidence in the ecosystem. So we all need to be working together to build that ecosystem, and then that slope will figure out on itself on its own. We can't lose confidence or like get wishy-washy about our planning horizons.
As the representative to the commercial trucking world, the big challenges we see it is connecting to the grid. And just to try to position that statement, I heard if you want to buy an internal combustion commercial truck right now, the order boards tend to be sold out for a year ahead of time. So if you need a new truck, you've wrecked one, you've got new business, it's going to take you a year to get a new internal combustion engine vehicle. But a new battery electric truck, I've always been telling people 6 to 9 months. I heard one of the fleets on stage this morning change it to 3 to 6 months. There just aren't many utilities set up to respond in 3 months to a new battery electric truck. So it's a challenge to get that portion of this done in the speed that truck fleets want to see it happen.
So I want to talk about the planning side from the utility perspective next. So the next question is for Harneet. From the perspective of a regulated power utility, how do they think about planning ahead for EV growth? And fundamentally, why does it take so long to get connected? Why is there sometimes not space on the grid where we need it?
So I think the connections requirements that we put in will help with the timelines and setting up that aspect of it. But to generally answer, what is it that utilities need to do? And the talk about planning and the shift in planning. My background, I'm a planning utility planning engineer. There's a fundamental shift, I think, that's taking place with what we're seeing come to the grid, the pace at which it's coming, and even the bulkiness and the impact that it's having on the grid. I thought to answer that question, and I think the audience is a bit of a mix. Maybe how do utilities plan and what our expectations are? Utilities make money based on deployment of their capital. They come to us, the economic regulator, to help and establish a rate, and that rate is looked at from a prudency lens. We're looking to make sure that they're spending money in the right terms, right? They're monopolies in their service areas. We want to make sure they're building out the system prudently. So what does that mean? That means we need to make sure that the grid is there for the load that's coming. So we want to make sure that they're doing the right forecasting and the right planning to be able to set the right rates and build the right infrastructure to accommodate that. One of the things that we do is we set out what are our filing requirements. So when you come in for an application to talk about that, we are going to test a bunch of things. About 2 years ago, one of the changes we made was to specifically call out the need to have representation of what the EV infrastructure needs will be for your system and to talk about the needs from an EV perspective. Number two, planning is getting a bit more challenging because there's a challenge with some of the data that they've had. And I'd say that the challenge is getting better because there's more access to the data. There's also more innovative methods that could be used for better planning. But how do you actually plan and forecast for it? So we provided a bit of guidance around how you can actually do some of that, knowing that it's not going to be an accurate number. We know that there's going to be different variations of penetration along the system. We realize that they need to account for some variability in it, and we expect them to build that into their applications. So setting the requirements for utilities was important for us to make sure that they're building the system for the needs of the customer. The other thing we do is we've provided some guidance about last year that I think has been helpful to the sector. First off, and this is going back to residential customers, we know that EVs bring on a bit more load to the system too, including at the household level. In the province of Ontario, most utilities offer a 200 amp service. There were still some that offered 100. So we issued a bulletin just saying, we're expecting that, you should be issuing 200 amps. We think it's reasonable. And the other thing that we did was looking at, if someone buys an EV, the last thing they need to be doing is getting a triggered bill for upgrades on the system because of that one EV. Two things come in mind. One, did the utility do the prudent planning they should have been doing to accommodate for some of this organic growth in their system? And then the other thing is maybe a bit of, the fundamentals are beneficiaries pay. That's how we sort of do rate design. That's how we sort of attribute the costs. But who's benefiting from an upgrade to a line transformer? It's not just going to be this one customer. We know heat pumps are coming. We know there's more electric vehicles coming on the system. So to socialize the costs are sometimes reasonable. And so we put out a bulletin to provide that clarity and to really reshape people's thinking about who is the beneficiary and who should be paying for some of this stuff. All these things are going to help bring in more and make sure that the grid is there for the connections that are coming.
Okay, thank you. Going back to the forecasting question, Dave, can you talk a little bit about the work you've been doing in the US with the National Renewable Electricity Lab around fleet utility coordination?
Appreciate it. A lot of the work that's going on in the US is with EPRI, the Electric Power Research Institute, and their new e-roadmap tool so that people can go on and look at forecasted demand by years in different areas, and you can have different size searches so you can get very specific down to about a quarter square mile grid, so you can look at where are different loads forecasted to be coming on. The truck fleet side of the world, we tend to congregate together. We're on one or two sides of town. So the challenge to utilities becomes, as we start electrifying, there's a lot of load in one particular spot. Next time you're flying into your town, look over and look for those big white roofs. Those are your distribution and warehouse centers, and that's where the commercial trucks are going to tend to come together. So it's going to be a challenge for the trucking industry and the utility industry to plan together and work together so that we can move forward smoothly.
Okay, so we've covered residential, we've covered trucking. I just want to talk quickly about public chargers as well. So Rasika, are we building the right kinds of public chargers today, or how is that sector going to need to evolve and plug into the planning process?
Yeah, so for a car company like ours, our customers at the heart of everything. So for us, future proofing means that a customer can get their EV's full potential, not just at home, but also on the go. So I'll give you just insights from two beautiful souls actually that go around the world doing setting Guinness World Records, and they have driven. They've done across set Guinness World Records in Europe, U.S., and more recently Canada. So last summer they drove a Volkswagen ID4 from St. John's, Newfoundland, to Victoria, BC, and just used 18 charging stops. And I had the opportunity to meet them, and they, by the way, they document their land, and then on the way they did the rest of the country on the way back, but the more scenic route to take beautiful photographs. So they document every country when they do it, and they have a website. So it's I did have the chance to meet them, and I asked them, okay, so in contrast to all the other countries you drove in and set Guinness World Records in, how did Canada's public charging network compare? And they said, well, when they were done gushing about how beautiful our country is, they said, uh, what was interesting to us is like we do a lot of pre-planning before we do these Guinness World Record drives. And when we brought up the map of Canada, it's like, wow, you guys have a lot of chargers. But then when you filter for 150 plus kilowatts, it suddenly gets very barren or scarce. And if they are there, they weren't in the right places for them to reliably use them. So they said, you have a lot of chargers, but it's a lot of 50 kilowatts. And the future is 350 kilowatts or one and at least 150 minimum. And I agree with that because even our next, I was right now our Volkswagen's rated for, depending on the battery size, up to 175, and then Audi's next Q6 e-tron is at 270 kilowatts. So what 270 kilowatts means is you charge from 10 to 80% in 21 minutes, as long as I have that flow going. And so any place where people are spending 20 minutes or less should be truly ultra fast charging. That would be like the observation I'd say about are we building the right kind of chargers? I think level two does have a role in a use case. I think any place where people spend more than 4 hours, like thinking hotels, workplaces, tourist destinations, sure, they play a good role there. But I'm a little concerned that to date, it's been a numbers game. People just say, I want thousands of chargers. And that results in a lot of 50 kilowatt chargers, whereas we could maybe be more intelligent about how we spend that money and make it count for the customers.
So how should public charging providers decide where to build, what to build, to consider these coverage issues, but also the needs of the electricity system? Because these are significant new loads that need to be accommodated.
I think if we get a residential charging done right, and I mean like truly done right strategically, then we can be a lot more intentional about where public chargers should be. So for again, it comes back to the customer. If they can do if they have access to home charging, whether they're in a home or a condo, condos are harder. But if they did, then in theory they could be waking up every morning with the full tank, um, on low cost, off peak energy, better for the grid. And so if then the 80% of their use charging actually happens at home, and then public charging is, like I mentioned, truly fast charging, 150 kilowatt plus, when you're road tripping or you're going 20 minutes or less. And then my hope would be, because I mean, Toronto, I think, is still the number one city in North America for cranes. So it's like, and we're only building up, right? So it's like our urban center, like Canada's 80% urbanized. We all live in an urban center or a big metropolitan area. So if we got our big CMAs to make sure that these new condos that are being built up and that these new mixed use residential commercial areas where people are going to work, live, and play, like they're set up for charging from day one. Um, that to me that's critical of whether or not this transition happens at the urgent pace that's expected, and also regulated. If you miss that opportunity, it's the biggest missed opportunity in my view.
Okay. Before we finish off with planning, is there anything anyone would like to add on how commercial EV customers and utilities can work together more closely in the future to make sure that they're coordinated and planning together?
I think for prudent planning, you need the data, and if you're not speaking to your providers, that's a problem, right? For us, especially with the example of a big fleet coming in, traditional planning will require housing starts. You're talking to your city or municipality. Some of the challenges you're actually talking about are past decisions around poor planning potentially, right? You've planned to put all these big fleets in a zoned area, and now from an electricity planning perspective, that's causing more problems if they're electrifying. But having those conversations earlier with your utility is really helpful because then they can plan for some of this stuff. Some of those investments, especially on the big, large fleet, not residential, but the large fleets, they're big and bulky. They can have significant changes to what planning assumptions utilities are making. The other thing is the earlier you speak to them, especially if assuming you have the ability to move or you're looking to bring in a fleet, you could relocate or locate to a spot where it's ideal in the system. Again, beneficiary pays. If you trigger investments, you'd be paying for them, but there's parts of the system where we know there's available capacity. Let's try and utilize that. Speak to your utility. They can help guide some of that conversation.
Okay.
There's a bunch of things we need to do better. And one of the things that hits me right between the eyes is talking with EPRI that a lot of utilities have load forecasting forms that they want filled out because they're used to people building new homes and new buildings. They're not used to people doing EV depots. We need forecasting forms on what are you trying to do initially and what does your facility look like once it's completely built out and when is that? How many kilometers per year are you going with each of these different types of vehicles and giving the utility an idea of what does it look like initially and what do I need to plan for that's 5, 10, 15 years down the road because it's going to be a big change. So working through this is going to be a lot of conversations. I was really quite intrigued at a recent utility conference. One of a couple of the utilities were talking on a panel like this and suggested that the utilities and truck fleets ought to be signing NDAs so they could have very open conversations with each other on what they're thinking of doing. And it also makes the fleet a little more comfortable, especially in a situation like the companies that have promised to electrify most rapidly are e-commerce delivery companies. Well, there's a good chance that Purolator, DHL, FedEx, UPS, etc., Amazon, their facilities are all very close to each other. So sharing information on who's doing what, where, and when can be pretty touchy. So the utilities obviously need to have as much of that forecasting as possible so that the grid can be scaled up appropriately.
Yeah.
One thing I forgot to mention, and it comes down to keeping costs low for these connections. It's one thing to have capacity, but let's not forget, like our infrastructure in Ontario, anyways, there's replacement that happens along the way. And when you do replacements, that's an ideal time to have the best data. The last thing you want to do is show up right after an overhaul of a bunch of assets. So, if you're able to join in and be part of that conversation, the utility's looking to make some changes anyways. They probably have capital put aside to do some of that. you'd be looking at, the incremental costs for whatever you're bringing on. It's probably the sweet spot in terms of trying to get involved with an upgrade. So timing and getting information to those utilities is important for a lot of reasons.
Okay. Uh, so I want to go back to Dave with this next one and talk a little more about this interconnection process. So you're a fleet manager, you're trying to electrify your depot. What is it actually like going through that process with the utility, and what can what can utilities do to make that easier, faster, cheaper? Like, what is the best practices here?
Great question. One of the best practices, every 2 years, we do a demonstration called Run on Less to show off what the best in the truck industry can do. And it started with diesel
Mm.
trucks, but in 2021, we did a pilot with 13 different makes of commercial EV trucks all around the US and Canada. We did it again in 2023, but this time at scale, and all the fleets had to have at least 15 battery electric trucks on one lot. One of the things we learned when we went out and interviewed fleets in 2021, I specifically interviewed a fleet when I asked, well, who's your utility company and how did you work with them? They wouldn't even state that utilities company's name on film because they were so drastically upset with them. They had called them and said, we're starting to electrify. Can you come and have a conversation with us to help us plan? We're really busy right now. We'll get with you in 5 or 6 months. Well, that went over like a lead balloon, and they managed to figure out they had enough power for the initial stage on their own, so they didn't even work with their utility company and didn't talk to them. As I gave a presentation and made that statement to a group like this shortly thereafter, one of the utilities in the room was shocked by that fleet response, and they went back and had a special internal program. We want to ensure we're never that utility, the one that the fleet won't ever mention their name. And what they did was start looking at all their processes and where are we sequential today that we could operate in parallel in the future. And one of the things that's a big time hog potentially that isn't even the utility's responsibility, they're involved with it, but that's getting the permitting done. On our demonstration in 2023, we had 10 very large depots that all agreed well ahead of time as to what we were doing, and we would come out and video them and install the telematics and all that. Two of them ended up not getting their infrastructure in time because the authorities having jurisdiction didn't approve their permitting. So when we launched this demo effort, they were running off of temporary charging systems. So it can be a dramatic slowdown if permitting doesn't fall in place quickly. So I don't know how many utilities have that kind of relationship with the permitting bodies to say, hey, folks, this is going to happen faster than we've been responding in the past, and we need to find ways to work together more rapidly and explain to you what's coming.
Okay, so Harney, we spoke a little about standardization. Are there other things that an economic regulator can do to facilitate this connection process and encourage utilities to do all of these great things?
So one of the things that David just mentioned is around the transparency and the access to data. One of the things that we're going to look to do is we know there's pockets in the province where there's available capacity. Going back to the point that if there's a spot you can connect on, you should be going there ideally. One is yes, speak to your utility. They may have better insights on some of that, but getting that information more transparent in front of folks and in their hands is one of the things that we'd like to do. So my team's been looking at getting capacity maps essentially to look at where is capacity available in the system on the distribution side. We just ran a survey amongst our utilities to see, what maturity in the technology and capability of data is there, and it looks like we're good to go from that perspective. So we'll be bringing forward some recommendations back to the minister's office to look at what does that information sharing look like, and how do we kind of get that going for the province? I think that's going to help out a lot. That's going to direct people and give people the data they need to make decisions.
Okay, thanks. We have a few minutes left of the questions, so I just want to talk a little bit about the rates side as well. So there was an announcement yesterday on new rates in Ontario, but we're also interested in what's going on across Canada. So I'll start here with Rasika. Maybe you could just explain demand charges and why they matter for these ultra-fast public chargers?
Sure. So Volkswagen Group, we kind of made a very intentional decision to focus on when we do invest in public charging, it's high performance charging networks. And we made those decisions as early as like prior to 2015, actually, because it was focused on. We knew that that would be the gap or the segment that would be the slowest to fill out, because that's also the most the type of public charging that's most exposed to high energy costs and demand charges. So, for example, last quarter, it, in Ontario, depending on where the site was energized, actual data was it ranged from $6 to kilowatt to $17 a kilowatt. So it's highly variable. And then, so in general, what we need if you want more private sector investment in that space, and especially in a time where there's lower utilization, because there's still fewer cars in operation, and you still have a high capex and opex, is you need more predictability and a truly equitable market or level playing field for energy costs and demand charges. So in Ontario, there's just a high degree of variability depending on which utilities in the area. And then in BC and Quebec, there's a slightly different dynamic. So you have utilities that own and operate their own uh, fast charging networks that are directly competing with other private sector networks. And so there's two things that could go on. One is they're not affected by demand charges and don't necessarily have to pass it along because it's left pocket, right pocket. Whereas a competing private sector that doesn't have that upper hand, can't. They have to either absorb it or pass it along to the customer. And then in other places, or they have another situation where they might experiment with innovative rates like Ontario just announced they're looking into. Um, but they can make it so that there's a lot of red tape before a private sector network can benefit from it. So if you think about it, if you're a North American wide network like Electrify America and slash Canada, and you're dealing with 230 plus utilities across North America, you can't then change your software backend to communicate specific data needs to different utilities. It's just the business case isn't there. So getting into a world where it's a lot cleaner to be able to benefit from innovative rates is important. So it's not just the what, it's the how.
Okay, I'll go to Dave next. If you could just talk about rates from the perspective of fleets and how much they worry about that compared to the upfront cost, which rates are maybe friendlier to electric fleets?
Well, fleets are obviously concerned about the upfront cost because the battery electric trucks are at least t- 2 to 3 times more expensive than the internal combustion engine. So that's a significant challenge. But the charging rates are also important. And a few years ago, a lot of us had this perception that trucks and chargers would have a one-to-one relationship and that trucks would charge from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., that the fleets would get smart charging and we wouldn't start charging until the utilities really wanted us to turn it up, and the system would automatically turn up at 11 p.m. or 12 p.m. And then we started getting out into the real world and finding out that might work for some people, but doesn't work at all for other people. I think one of the most intriguing challenges I heard was a very large automotive assembly plant. Sorry, not Volkswagen, but this situation could happen at any brand of automotive assembly plant. They have roughly 40 tractors that are moving trailers around with parts feeding the building all times a day. They typically run 2 shifts. Those 40 tractors are in constant motion during the time that the production line's moving. The only time they have to charge them is the downtime between shifts. And if they're running overtime, that time between shifts gets smaller and smaller. So they're going to be charging all 40 trucks all at once, and it's set by whatever the hours of the assembly plant are. It doesn't have anything to do with what the cost structure from the utility is. We don't have that flexibility. It's now or never we charge these trucks. So there's situations we're getting into that just don't fit that paradigm of it's cool. We'll charge at night. You won't notice it. We'll be good. We've got some extremely high. The demonstration we did with the 10 fleet EV depots, several of them already have 5 megawatt feeds, and one of them was pulling down, as best we could estimate, 44 megawatt hours per day to charge their Class 8 fleet of 82 trucks. So those are kind of numbers that are just huge and crazy to utility companies. You're doing what? So it's an interesting challenge as we move forward. It's not straightforward and there aren't easy answers.
So I'll move on to Harneet now. Could you just speak about how economic regulators can support EVs through rate design, whether or not they're flexible in the timing of their charging?
Yeah, sure. So, rate and rate design is really important in this aspect because it can drive behavioral changes, but it can do a lot more. So let's talk a little bit about that and unpack this. So I'll start with residential first. And in the province of Ontario, we introduced a new rate called ULO, which is ultra low overnight charging. The whole point of that is, utilities generally used to build to peaks. And, if you're trying to build anything higher than the peak they're at, that's going to cost money. We can clip the peak, we can shift the peak. And in this case, we did a lot of work around behavioral studies around what would really drive consumer change. What is the spread between the price you would need to drive behavioral changes? And so that was part of the thinking when we built out the ULO rates was, how do we shift the daytime peaks to the nighttime? And from the customers that have signed up for it, we can see that that pattern certainly has made an impact. They are charging at night. You're seeing a lot of their loading in that space. When you start getting into bigger charging, these demand charges that we're talking about, it becomes a bigger issue in that space. So, where you've got a charger that gets used once a month, they set that peak for the month, and the demand charge is a function of that peak. So if no one ever comes and uses it again, aside from the consumption of the electricity, you've hit this peak for that owner of that infrastructure. In areas where there's low adoption, that demand charge can be a lot of money. And the point of what we're doing now is to look at what is a low load factor pricing model look like. So there was an announcement here yesterday with the minister announcing the work that we're doing on that. And what we're looking at is where are there charging infrastructures that are less than 15%. So we've set sort of a number at 15% utilization, and to look at like how can we actually shift the demand charges. And we talked about different utilities having different rates across the province. We're trying to tackle this through what we call transmission tariffs, which all utilities end up collecting. So we have an ability to standardize the impact on the bill through the collection of the transmission rates. So that's how we're going to look to make modifications. We've done a lot of work that we are now taking out to the sector. So as part of this consultation, we'll be asking for input to look at what we're looking to design here. But we've done a lot of homework to help the conversation along. So that is open, and I'll just plug our website. If you go to OEB and you look for EWU, engage with us. It's a platform we've used to help with our consultations to get input from the sector. You can follow along with the meetings, what's happening in them, and the material associated with it. And if you've got perspective you want to chime in on, make sure you get a chance to voice your input.
Great, thank you. So that's the end of my questions for the day. So now I'm going to open it up to the audience. If you have any questions, there's a microphone at the back that you can use, and then our panel can respond.
Don't be shy. We get smarter by talking with each other.
Oh, I see we have one.
Thanks so much for the discussion. Carolyn Kim from UPS Canada. My question is for Harneet, but happy to hear from the rest of the panel. In addition to the rate design, are there opportunities for utilities to come together? And let's just focus on Ontario, where utilities can come together and just, you know, work out with commercial fleets on where the demand is and expedite. I know that there's a lot of initiatives in terms of streamlining the process and considering new rate designs. Can you talk a little bit about maybe the role of the OEB in bringing the utilities together even more to ensure that we're kind of minimizing the interconnection period and just kind of shortening that time to get to electric vehicles at scale?
Sure. So the changes that we've just made in the connections procedure are going to come into force end of this month. So I think we're going to learn and see how the sector is reacting to that. So that's new, and we'll keep a pulse on that. I will say that you asked what role we play. We do play a role in regional planning. So within the province, within all the LDCs that are in our province, we want to make sure there's coordination. Part of the challenge with 60 of them, we want to make sure everyone's talking together. As we're building transmission infrastructure, we want to make sure that the distributors below them, have the power they need. So bringing them together at regional planning working groups, which is an initiative that we facilitate, and we are the leaders in it. You can also join our Engage with the website. We do have a section dedicated to that too. But regional planning is a function that the OEB helps facilitate. And it's really there to make sure that utilities are speaking, making sure that we understand where the load is coming, especially the big, large, bulky stuff that's going to impact the transmission network and then subsequently impact distribution. That's one of our important initiatives. And in that, I was talking earlier about we want utilities to make sure they're building forecasts for EVs in their system. It was through that discussion forum and that working group where we came forward with recommendations on how utilities can start looking at assumptions for EV load forecasting. So it's an important forum. And there's an Engage with Us website to help engage with you folks further on it if you want to.
Okay, thank you. We have one more question in the back.
Hi, Vincent Cowell from Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters. So we've talked a lot about integration between EV charging and the grid, the need from the grid. What about distributed energy resources? And maybe Rizika specifically, I know Volkswagen's doing a lot of work integrating renewables in Europe. Working with a lot of manufacturers, sometimes one of the things that we see is there's factories, there's really big buildings that have rooftops with a lot of room on them, and there's also an ability to use contracts to have new generation online. So maybe wanted to hear you a little bit on that.
Okay, so let's start with Rasika, and then I'll let the other panelists chime in.
Sure. I think, like on the manufacturing side, there's two ways of looking at it. So there's zero emitting or non emitting sources, which does include nuclear. And then depending on where you're based in the world, your definition of what might be considered um, clean energy might also factor into sustainability and other sources. So they might have more narrow view or criteria of what's green. So I think, but right now our mix is the way the mix is, and the way that the Ontario current market, and Kearney, correct me if I'm getting anything wrong here, but my understanding is we have the clean energy certificates landscape or the market, and different provinces are doing it differently. But I think what's going to be important is there a business case for private sector investment into renewables in this scheme? Because ultimately, the ability to buy certificates or the ability to enter into virtual power purchase agreements or direct power purchase agreements, if you are a big bulk manufacturer and not necessarily in the energy making business, you will need that market to be here to get access. And I will stress that it's very important if Canada wants to compete with other jurisdictions in the manufacturing space. There are other many jurisdictions that have gotten renewable energy right. And for Volkswagen Group, renewable energy at our manufacturing is a very clear KPI that we're tracking and already have progress on around the world. So some of our plants are already at 100% renewable energy through either on-site solar parks, and then any excess is through usually power purchase agreements through whether it be wind or solar solutions. Hydro is also an option. So I think in order to attract more and more investment, when ESG is becoming highly relevant in the world, a renewable energy strategy, at least, is important.
Let's do Dave next.
From the commercial truck side of the world, one of the most intriguing statements I've heard recently at a conference: most truck fleets don't buy from one fuel supplier today. Why would they only buy from one fuel supplier in the future? And it was leading to the conversation that microgrids are out there and they have a lot of different benefits, but it's a really odd conversation. The fleets barely know what the grid is, much less a microgrid. And many utilities don't want to talk about microgrids. It isn't necessarily beneficial to their organization or their business. But there are certainly opportunities for fleets that are struggling to get as much power as they want rapidly from a utility, that there are now companies that can provide a microgrid on a skid or microgrid in an ISO container and bring it to your facility, set it on the ground, and get it connected quite rapidly. They can provide initial power that isn't available off the grid. They can serve the purpose of resiliency once you are up and running, that if something happens to the grid, you can still keep moving forward. we know of at least one or two fleets that have already put full-on microgrids in place to help balance out their risk and their opportunities moving forward and help protect themselves from hitting demand charges and time of use situations where, hey, we've got enough in our battery energy storage system that'll get us through these time periods where we don't want to be buying power from the utility company, and the utility company doesn't want us sucking up their power. So it's a mutually beneficial situation. So I've also run into a situation with a microgrid that was set up with the utility company. So if the power level was sagging, they could instantly start that system and support the grid. So there can be very supportive relationships moving forward between commercial vehicle fleets and utility companies. It's just completely new ground for a lot of us that'll take a lot of negotiating and engineering and conversations.
Okay, anything to add?
Yeah, I got lots to add, but I'll be quick. So bringing on DERs, is helpful for the system, and it's one thing to say it's nice to have. Um, we've actually made changes to our code here in Ontario, and it's to account for something we've called flexible capacity hosting, and this is why it's important. Right now, a lot of our system, not a lot of our, there are parts of the system that are constrained, right? We call them restricted feeders. You can't bring any more DERs on them. They've either hit their thermal or short circuit limits, but the code was written in a way that looks at those peaks. But what we also know is that the technology that utilities have deployed in the field and in their control rooms, they can be far more nimble using grid modernization technology that can manage the peaks, right? Let's get away from building the peaks. Let's manage peaks. And that's the expectation. And so we made changes to the code to say, sure, you have DR123. You've told us you've tapped out, but we know that the system isn't always peaking. We know that you have the ability to also be a bit more dynamic and nimble. Bring on DER number 456 and manage a lot better. That's how we'd get to what we call flexible orchestration of the grid. There's a lot of discussions around distributed system operators and other energy models. Bringing on DERs helps in a whole bunch of stuff. And you talked about resiliency. There's a lot of benefits to it. Going back to let's not build the peaks, let's manage peaks. I think that's the fundamentals we need to focus on.
Okay, we have time for one very quick question. Um, and if not, we can wrap it up there. So thank you everyone for joining us today. It was a really interesting discussion. I also want to thank Electric Autonomy for organizing this great event. And finally, I want to thank my three panelists for sharing their thoughts with us today. So thank you.